Okay, so I'm going to talk about forest fire ecology in France and the Mediterranean, maybe giving more billing to the Mediterranean than to France. I was looking back through the seminars that I've had the privilege of giving in the School of Forestry. The first two on this list were defense seminars for my master's and PhD research presentations. And then in 2003, I talked with you about the Grand Canyon. In 2006, about Spain. And today, about France, Greece, Cyprus, Morocco, and a little bit of Spain again. And I just kind of liked that. I thought that was a nice set of places to have had the opportunity to work and the opportunity to talk with you about. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the idea of what are the drivers of fire regimes in general, but in particular we're often concerned with big fires, and a word that lately has been used a lot in the literature to try to capture the idea of big fires or problem fires, fires that are of particular concern to management, to society, to conservation, is mega fires. So I'll use that context a little bit, and then think a bit about how we can understand the drivers of these kinds of fires in order to make better decisions about the future, decisions about management, about economics, about society. And bearing in mind that the future includes a warming climate, so that has a lot of implications for fire regimes. In looking at this particular sabbatical experience, I was really struck by kind of the events and experiences that led up to it and the possibilities that may follow from it. So it's a little bit more like a passage along a longer professional and personal journey rather than just a single isolated event or one concrete research project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that pathway, how one thing has led to other opportunities, and possibly for some people here who are undergraduates or graduate students or postdoctoral scholars, there might be it might open up some ideas of thinking perhaps a little farther afield of some things to do with your professional skills. And then I'm going to spend most of the time on talking about identifying partners and sites for research. So a lot of what I did during this sabbatical semester was locate sites and partners with whom I could work to develop projects in the future. I'll talk a little bit about the next steps after that, and then the learning and teaching opportunities abroad that I mentioned. So let's see, can I use this thing? That's the pointer. No? Okay. So returning to that first theme of megafires, we have plenty of experience very close to home with what we could consider to be megafires, like the Wallow Fire here in 2011, largest wildfire in the history of the Southwest so far, linked to drought conditions in that 2011 year, a very large fire. But the United States and North America and remote places like Siberia are not the only places that experience very large and socially very important fires. So in Greece, for instance, in 2007, there were mega fires, a very large number of fires, but the total area burned in this set of mega fires is actually bigger than the Wallow Fire, whereas Greece is not that big of a country, and within Greece there's not that much forest and wildlands that can burn. So it's actually a striking amount of calamity for the environment, for the economy because of the great expense associated with these fires, but then the biggest negative consequence of all in this case was that a large number of people were killed in these fires. In looking at megafires of Europe, this is a study from 2013 that traces area burned in European countries. The light green color here is Portugal, and there's a couple of years where Portugal made up a very substantial area burned in Europe. And then in 2007, this light blue color is Greece. Looking at the overall trend here, there's no real trend to the area burned, which is the vertical bars. there's actually a slight downward trend over this period in terms of the number of fires. But the idea of megafires in a human context is this notion of having multiple large fires that are concentrated in space and time in a socioeconomic context that's very important, just like the example we just saw with Greece. So while looking at Europe as a whole, there might not be any giant changes here, the concentration of severe fires that burn large areas and have big consequences is what makes them a megafire. In contrast, a fire of this size, burning in some remote wilderness area, burning in Canada, don't mean to denigrate Canada, burning in a remote area of Canada might not be socially particularly important or might not have a lot of ecological consequences. So there are some key driving factors associated with megafires all around the world. This is a nice paper by Scott Stevens and others that came out last year looking at the characteristics associated with megafires and the challenges to society of trying to deal with them. So one of those factors is warming climate, and we certainly see that in the western United States. These are data from Moat et al. Showing warming. The red means warming. This is a map of western United States and southwestern Canada. The size of the circle is proportional to the amount of warming. That's not a prediction for the future. That's an observation of the past. That's the last half of the 20th century. So when we talk about temperature changes, about warming and its effects on environments, we're often thinking of the future, but in this case we're looking back. And here is a study very well known, I think, to everyone that works with fires in this room, which is an awful lot of people. This is work by Westerling and others, Tony Westerling, tracing temperature over the last 3 decades or so and looking at area burned and showing how there's a trend in the temperature line moving upwards and there are strong spikes in area burned associated with temperature. So that integrates a huge amount of area across the whole western United States. There are differences in fuels and in the pattern of El Nino during that period and management actions and all that, but when we look at the big picture, pulling it all together, we see these kinds of trends. This one indicates earlier onset, a trend towards earlier onset of snowmelt, which means that fuels tend to dry out earlier in the fire season. So we have warming climate, and similar kinds of patterns exist in Europe as well. A second issue is policies that excluded past fire regimes that kept fuel levels low. That's a very familiar concept here in the Southwest, where we had frequent fire regimes in the past. The interruption of those fire regimes has changed the forest and allowed fuels to accumulate. There can also be disturbances, such as tree-killing insects, that can change fuel situations rather abruptly, perhaps leading to a spike in the flammability of a forest while dead foliage is still on the trees, and then a reduction later. That's also common here and in other parts of the world. Item number 4, in a lot of ways, is something that's a little bit different to us in the United States. The abandonment of traditional agricultural and pastoral practices followed by increases in flammable vegetation. This is an extremely important component in the Mediterranean basin of changes in fuels, of landscapes that were very heavily used by people, used for farming and used for pastoralism of domestic animals, practices that were greatly reduced in intensity, especially on the northern part of the northern part of the Mediterranean on the European side, where much land was abandoned for these kinds of uses pretty much after World War II. So you have a period of 60, 70 years where flammable native fuels have been recolonizing areas that perhaps for several thousand years before that were quite heavily used for agriculture. And then another category of fuel changes that, at least in the Southwest, doesn't necessarily hit home for us too much, but in a nation like Spain can be very important, where reforestation or afforestation programs have introduced tree plantations in previously non-forested areas and created new fuels. So the issue about these drivers is that they're interconnected. Warming climate is going to affect the occurrence of of insect outbreaks. It affects the occurrence of fires. It affects the suitability of certain kinds of land uses, etc. So there's a very complex web here of different drivers. But it's important to try to have as good of a perspective as possible on what the relative strengths are of these drivers in order to try to make the most useful decisions for the future. We are certainly facing a lot of uncertainty in the future. Some of us in this room in class today were talking about predictions associated with fire in the 21st century under different scenarios of climate change, and there were predictions that went in all sorts of different directions. It's very difficult to know with certainty what is going to come. But the better our information and the better our understanding of the relationships of these drivers, the more likely it is that we can make the most intelligent possible decisions. So fire regimes are often looked at in terms of the relationship between what are called top-down factors and bottom-up factors. Top-down, the main driver here is climate variation, which can be even within a single year or from year to year or over much longer periods of time. A few years, such as the effects of El Nino and La Nina, up to oscillations that are over periods of decades to many decades to centuries. It's called top-down regulation because the climate affects a large area and controls it, as it were, from the top down. Bottom-up regulation refers to the changes, the differences from one place to another in terms of topography, fuels, and so on. The occurrence of ignitions, which is hugely important in a fire regime, but sometimes difficult to predict. And then management action, so things that people do that create fuels, that remove fuels, etc. on the landscape. So we have a lot of different kinds of variables, different kinds of data that's needed to try to understand not which of these drivers is more important, because that's not a logical question, but what are the relative importances of different drivers and how they relate to each other, and what kinds of cascading effects do our actions have in the future. So in order to try to understand this in a given fire regime, we would want to know about the past and current fire regime. A lot of times we think first about the frequency of fire occurrence, but that's only one of many elements in a fire regime. We have to think about the type of fire, surface fire, crown fire, size, season, the distribution of these variables over space and time. Past and current structures of forest and fuels, past and current climate, not just averages, but how much it varies and what kinds of oscillating patterns there are. This history of human interactions with the landscape, just like the land abandonment that we mentioned a moment ago. And then we need to think about all of these things in the context of future scenarios. So future scenarios of climate management and vegetation shifts. So it's really an extraordinary number of things to try to bring together. But in fact, it is possible to pull a lot of these elements together. This is a schematic that was made by Amanda Stan for some work that we were doing to try to explain how these different elements fit together and where the data sources can come from. So if we look at climate, and this vertical line is about the present, we can look at climate records going back into the past about 100 years, but there are reconstructions, especially from tree rings, that go back much farther. We can look at climate models and do what's called hindcasting, which is to say to run a model when you already know the answer. You run a model for past conditions and see how well it reflects reality when you know what the reality was, and that gives you more confidence to make forecasts with that model or with those models. So similarly with fire regimes, we have modern records, but we can go much further back in the past with tree ring reconstructions. We can use models in this case as well. And then we can use models and data related to forests. So structural elements of forests, things like their basal area, their density, their height. Fuel-related variables like the amount of canopy fuels that could carry a fire through the crowns or the surface fuels. And then species composition. So what kinds of forest communities we had and what are the adaptations of those different species. And we can look at all that information in the past as well and then bring in forecasts for the future. it's important that these things be able to interact with each other. So our forecast for future forest conditions needs to be informed by what the future climate is going to be like. If we're running those things separately, then that's not really that useful of an output. These are some examples from work that we've done in our lab to try to bring together several sets of these variables. And these examples are very similar to the kinds of work that's going on in many, many places here in this building and all around the western United States and the world. So this is a big flowchart diagram. I only put it here because I like all the boxes and arrows, but this is an example of using historical data from a landscape, using the forest vegetation simulator model to predict how that changed over time. If we do a hind casting using past data, then we can check how accurate it was up to the present and then allow it to project into the future and look at the effects on fire behavior. Down here, this is work by Amanda Stan and others on looking at a landscape fire regime on Wallapai tribal lands in northwestern Arizona. Across a large landscape of ponderosa pine broken up by valleys and stringers of other vegetation, they were able to reconstruct the fire-climate relationship for several centuries in the past, the way in which El Nino, for instance, interacted with fire ignition, with fire spread across the landscape, and also showed in this study that the Wallapai lands have a distinctly different modern fire history from most of the public lands in the Southwest, which is to say, beginning in the 1960s, they began to burn much more frequently. Here's an example of modifying the FVS model to incorporate climate scenarios. So a version called Climate FVS was created by Nick Crookston and Jerry Rayfelt, published a few years ago. These are projections for future temperature and precipitation in the eastern Mogollon Rim. This is on White Mountain Apache tribal lands in eastern Arizona. And precip is kind of all over the place. Temperature has a consistent trend. Some of the temperatures don't get too high in certain scenarios. Others get quite high. Here's what happens to growth of ponderosa pine if you apply those kinds of climate scenarios in the future. This black line is data from a ponderosa pine forest growing forward for 100 years under current climate conditions. Here's what happens to that species under the kind of moderate future climates. Here's what happens to that species under the more severe climate change options. The world, as it happens right now, is currently following the trajectory of the more severe. In terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, is following the more severe trajectory. One other interesting point right here is that for the first few decades, there's no difference between the outcome of these simulations, suggesting that the differences we see later on that might be really important might be lying in wait for us. Now, in North America, we have a tremendous amount of data to support some of the types of studies that I was just describing. This is a fire regime reconstruction network from fire-scarred trees across North America, from central Mexico really up through northern Mexico, very, very heavy in the middle of the United States and a little bit up into southwestern Canada. So many centuries of data about fire occurrence that can be compared with climate. It's possible over this broad geographical area to look at differences between El Nino, La Nina effects, and so on. These kind of data don't really exist in most other parts of the world. So now I'm going to switch to this journey part of things. As Haiti mentioned, I worked with ERI for many years. As she mentioned, since before it was ERI, but I know there's many people in this room that can claim the exact same thing. So that's not that big of a deal. But when I left ERI, my colleagues treated me to a roast on this theme of where in the world is Carmen Sandiego and where in the world is Pete Fule, and I like that. So the kind of start of this journey for me was after I finished my master's degree here at NAU and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Bolivia, in the Andes of South America, where I worked with a program that was aimed at incorporating trees in order to try to better the lives of really poor farmers. So to try to make some use of trees to hold back soils or to provide fruit or to be provide fuel wood, to try to be some assistance for people who economically had very little. So I'm right here. I dug this picture out and scanned it from an old photograph, and I showed it in a class of the Forestry and Developing Countries class. And the day I showed it, I swear I was wearing like the exact same shirt. Some of the interests and I don't know, experience with other cultures, with the Spanish language and so on that I really liked about being in Bolivia led me to do research in Mexico for a number of years. And it's over 20 years now that we have done a lot of fascinating projects on fire ecology, on forest ecology, all different regions of Mexico. Here we have Wanda Bruns and Rachel Sheridan. Many of you may have seen Rachel I think it was in this room, right? Because I was in France when she gave her defense last spring here at NAU, and it was like 3 in the morning where I was when she was in here speaking. But they both were students in the Peace Corps Masters International Program, which is an opportunity to combine graduate study with Peace Corps service, both working in Mexico. And then we've worked over many different regions of Mexico. In particular, Larissa Yoakum and Citlali Cortez have done a lot of work in the last 6 or 7 years on a variety of different themes, fire-climate interactions. Larissa's here sampling a fire-scarred tree. Citlali is putting plants in a plant press, looking at the structure of old-growth forests, frequently burned forests, in many cases forests that are very similar to those of the southwestern United States, sometimes right across the border in the state of Chihuahua, but dramatically different in terms of the management, the human interaction that has happened to them over the last 130 years or so. In the laboratory, as you can see here, we cross-date the tree rings and determined the dates of fires that scarred the trees in these wounds that are shown right here, reconstruct the history of fire. So from this work, today there's about 52 sites, probably a few more since this graph was made, in Mexico of fire climate sites, contributing to that big network I showed for North America. And our lab has contributed something like half of those. So that's a pretty nice thing. And the work that we've done is also going straight into conservation of old-growth forests, into re-examining fire management plans in Mexico, into looking at thick-billed parrot habitat just south of the Arizona border. So that's neat. It's a nice impact. In 2005, 2006, I had a sabbatical opportunity and went to spend that time in Barcelona, Spain, in Catalonia, at the University of Barcelona, working with Emilia Gutierrez, who is a dendrochronologist there. There are many outstanding dendrochronologists in Europe. Since we are in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is the birthplace of the science of dendrochronology, and the same state as the preeminent Dendro Lab, the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona. I won't take anything away from Arizona, but there are fantastic dendrochronologists in Europe. They have paid very little attention to the types of fire-related studies that I've been mentioning and have shown examples of in the United States and in Mexico. Why is that? One reason might be that fire in Europe, if you think of the continent of Europe, wildland fires are a regional problem. They're not a universal problem. And the region, while it's a very important region of the border of the Mediterranean, is not a gigantic region. Fire issues are not a pressing concern of forest health in Austria, in Germany, in the northern part of France, in the Scandinavian countries, and so on. Well, they do have some massive fires up there from time to time. But it's not at the forefront of research attention the way that it is in the western United States or in Australia, or in Canada, places that have paid a lot of research attention to these sorts of issues. So it was a terrific opportunity to make use of some of the perspectives, some of the ways of looking at using dendrochronology and using information about forests to work with people who are approaching forests from some different directions and kind of have a convergence of ideas. So here's the Mediterranean basin, which is to say the landscape surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. This is kind of a watershed diagram that shows the Mediterranean basin really is quite narrow in many nations. So in France, for instance, the Mediterranean is really only clipping off a small portion of the southern part of the country. Somewhat bigger in Spain, but still there's a lot of Spain that really doesn't fall in the Mediterranean basin and has climate patterns that are somewhat different. Italy is an exception to that, and Greece, of course, because they're fully within the basin, and then really the populated parts of North Africa, which tend to be right close to the Mediterranean Sea, are also in these kinds of environments. There are some very large population centers on the Mediterranean, and of course some of the areas of the world that are very much in the news because of social issues these days. In terms of some of the trees and the characteristics of forests in the Mediterranean area, the species that I've been particularly interested in and have studied in this experience in Spain and then more recently in my experience in France and these other places is this species here, Pinus nigra, black pine, or it's called Austrian pine a lot of times in the U.S. I don't really hear people call it Austrian pine. I haven't asked anybody in Austria, maybe that's where that name is favored. We had a presentation some years ago where somebody showed the range of Pinus sylvestris, which goes by the name of Scots pine, and it goes all across Siberia, and then there's like a dot of it in Scotland. So naturally it's called Scots pine. But Pinus nigra is in Spain, southern France, the Balkans, into Greece, Turkey, and then on Sky Island type mountains in North Africa. Pinus nigra is an interesting species because it's very similar in many adaptations to ponderosa pine and to many other related Mexican pines like Pinus durangensis or Pinus engelmanni in having adaptations associated with fire that make it very resistant to fire. It has very thick bark, a great capacity to be scorched and still survive. But if the trees are killed by fire, if there is a canopy fire, crown fire, then the trees don't have mechanisms for reproduction. They don't sprout, like most pines don't sprout. They do not have serotinous cones that would allow the seeds to be released after a fire and so on. So here's a Pinus nigra landscape post-fire. There's little strips, horizontal strips where they cut down trees and made erosion barriers, but no regeneration. This is another Mediterranean species, Pinus alepensis, Aleppo pine, and it looks like some trees standing in a grassy field or something. That's not grass. That's wall-to-wall seedlings. This species has serotinous cones. It's both serotinous and non-serotinous. It can reproduce under any circumstance. If you think of the Southwest and think of what kinds of species are really tough and are going to be here no matter what climate does to us, you might come up with juniper, for instance. Pinus alepensis is a species like that in the Mediterranean. So in these areas there was intensive agricultural use until the middle of the 20th century, then abandonment, and a lot of the vegetation in this photo, which is right behind these houses, is infilling of very flammable native vegetation, quite contiguous over the landscape that now supports fires in a way that wasn't possible under past heavy uses. But in this Spanish landscape, we found a rare spot. It's a small piece of publicly owned land where there was a remnant patch of quite old Pinus nigra forest. And also, as you can see in these pictures, very heavily burned on steep slopes. And in this site, we were able to document the presence of old trees in an uneven age stand, the oldest trees going back 363 years. That's not a remarkable length of time for this species. There's a fantastic place in Spain. If you go to Andalusia, if you go to near the city of Granada, there's a park called Cazorla. And there are Pinus nigra trees that are over 900 years old there. But there are not many 300-year-old Pinus nigra trees in Spain. I think maybe I've seen them all by this point. And very few of them are growing in any kind of a forest stand. They're growing as isolated individuals surrounded by other things. We found frequent surface fires in this forest up through the 20th century. The area burned severely in 2001. The forests around this remnant stand were killed. But the stand itself, probably because of some of the characteristics you can see here of a high canopy and very low surface fuels, simply had a surface fire. And we also looked at growth and carbon storage in this forest and suggested that when you look at the carbon equation, young, fast-growing stands are great for sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. But old stands of large trees hold a lot of carbon as biomass in the forest. And if you think about having some ecological values associated with those old forests as well, then there might be room for both types of forests across a landscape. Currently in Spain, in the Mediterranean part of Spain, there are many plantations of Pinus nigra that are rapidly burning up. In Catalonia, the big region of northeastern Spain, the one that you're going to read about right after you finish hearing all the news about Scotland's independence, Catalonia is voting on independence from Spain in November, so it'll be in the news all over the place. 1/4 of the Pinus nigra in Catalonia was burned in severe fires with high mortality in one decade, in the decade 1990 to 2000. So the research in Spain led to many different outcomes, including a lot of visits by Spanish researchers here, a lot of visits by me back to Spain trying to find more old Pinus nigra forests. 2 sabbaticals spent here at NAU by Jordi Cortina and Beatriz Dugoy, and many of you may remember them. An MS thesis by Alicia Espeleta, who was working at the University of Alicante but did her thesis project here. And then this European project called Fule, which is sort of a very shortened acronym for this super long title, Forest Fires Under Climate, Social and Economic Changes in Europe, the Mediterranean, and Other Fire-Affected Areas of the World. And that project went from 2010 to 2014. The large goals of that project, which occurred, it's a sort of a mega project, you could say, taking place in many different countries with many different scientific organizations, universities and research centers and so on. And their goals were trying to understand the past of fire, trying to compile records, whether from written records or dendrochronological records of past fire regime information, projections of future fire risk, asking how society can adapt to those changes, and trying to do knowledge transfer. This is really one of the first large projects like this focused on forest fires. And part of this information about understanding the past in this European context meant things like gathering fire records from different countries that have been kept in different ways, in different languages, in different databases, and trying to integrate them and have some sort of data quality idea and standard so that you can ask questions even about the last 10 years, not just hundreds of years in the past. So it's a remarkable assemblage of research and data. So that work took me to Greece to work in this area. This is Mount Taygetos. To the left, if you were to turn left in this picture and go down off the mountain, you would be in one of the 2 cities that I think almost everybody in this room could name in Greece. It's not Athens. It's Sparta. Well, maybe a third one, because if you turn right and go off this mountain, you would go to Kalamata. And a lot of people know the Kalamata olives. So here we worked with Natasa, who came to NAU to do the cross-dating and analysis of her fire-scarred samples, and Dimitris Sadis, who's a professor right now in Cyprus. And we went within the footprint of a Pinus nigra forest that was burned by the 2007 wildfire. So in 2007, I showed earlier that picture with describing the damages and the mortality and so on. In 2007, there was a huge wildfire here at Mount Taygetos. It was impossible to control. Villages were evacuated. Homes were burned. I don't believe any fatalities took place on this particular landscape. But what we wanted to ask was what was driving having such a large fire and how it differed from past fire events in the same landscape. So within the same landscape that burned in a very severe fire in 2007, a smaller portion of it had previously burned in a severe fire in 1998. We wanted to see, was it the case that fires had been excluded for a really long time and that maybe that had led to an accumulation of fuels? Was it the case that climate had changed either abruptly or gradually that was leading to a change in fires? Now you remember I said there were all these drivers and all these connections, and unfortunately we were not able to investigate all of them. We had to focus on the questions of the past fire regime and the past climate. So we collected fire scars, we created a fire history. We found what's summarized at the bottom of this line, using the French word for summary, is the pattern of fires that had taken place on this landscape. Right in here, this is 1950. You see some fires indicated by these vertical lines that crossed much of this landscape. And that was right during World War II when this was a center of Greek resistance to the occupying Nazi army. And so there are those kinds of historical connections that one can see in some of these landscapes. At least we think we see, because that was an unusually big fire event. But we found fairly frequent fires and a fair amount of occurrence of fires up to the present over the last 160 years or so. When we looked at maps, so these colors are the area covered by the fire scar sampling, and then the red are the places that burned. This is the 2007 fire. This is the 1998 fire. These are previous fires. We found that there were large fires prior to these two recent severe fires, but the most severe ones were the last two, and they were strongly correlated with unique moments in that climate history. So in the last 160 years or so, the two biggest fires were the two most recent fires, biggest and most severe, and they were coordinated with high temperature and low precipitation. The combination of the highest temperature and the lowest precipitation in the 160-year record. So Dimitri Sadis just published this analysis of that issue. Now one might ask, well, is that generally true? I mean, is the climate really changing in such a way that a lot of the mega fires in recent years are associated with these kinds of events? That's very hard to say, because right now there are only about 4 fire regime reconstructions in the Mediterranean that could even give you the kind of data that you would need to start looking at that sort of a question. And a couple of them have only a very small number of samples in them, so they're not quite as robust. Okay, so now I turn to this past spring, going to Provence. Provence is in the southeastern part of France. Here's a topographic map of France. You see the Pyrenees here on the Spanish border, the Alps going into Switzerland and Italy, and this is Corsica, the island of Corsica, which is also French, and you see the rugged topography there. It's a beautiful region of France. My goal was to work on wildfire and climate interactions in French forests, but that rapidly became Mediterranean forests, because there are very few forests that might have those kinds of criteria that I'm looking for here. Old forests, or at least old dead wood, that can be used to reconstruct past fire regimes, not only with fire scars, but with other kinds of data about the forest, like age distributions, looking for the possibility of even-aged versus uneven-aged forest structure, the species that are present, the details about the structure, either in Pinus nigra or closely related species. And then particularly would like to have places that have good links to management issues, such as the megafire example in Greece. And then we want to be able to couple that with climate data and land use history. So this is a report that came out in 2013 by the World Wildlife Fund on ancient forests on the European side of the Mediterranean. And that was extremely useful in trying to locate places and then to talk with individuals who had on-the-ground knowledge of these places in order to set up a visit to see whether they might be suitable. I worked in Aix-en-Provence, but I lived in Marseille. It's a fascinating city. I lived on this street, which had the interesting characteristic that struck me one day, that if you stood at the front door and looked around as far as you could see. There was not one plant to be seen anywhere in sight. Field work in France can be nice. These are some projects with colleagues. This one was a little staged. I had him take this picture on purpose so that I could come back and show that I had actually done something in the field. But here I'm measuring some seedlings that they planted under different competitive circumstances. In these two pictures with the big measuring poles, these places are people's backyards. These are wildland urban interface fuels where a woman named Anne Ganton is studying the flammability of that wildland urban interface environment and how it can be managed, what the risks are, and how it can be managed to try to reduce damages. This is Jeanne Baudin, who is a postdoctoral scholar, and here she's working with Mediterranean shrubs that were cut back to different levels in order to measure how fast the fuel reaccumulates. The answer is really fast, like a couple of years. So that kind of stuff doesn't help too much. A colleague here who's a dendrochronologist and was very helpful in showing us some areas of old forest or sort of old forest in Provence. And then James Aronson's name might be familiar to the many people in this room working in the restoration field. He's been one of the intellectual leaders of ecological restoration and has written a tremendous amount of articles and books on restoration. Here are other colleagues. Anne is the person I mentioned working in the wildland urban interface, and here doing studies on flammability of litter. And one of the things they were trying to do was collect litter beds that were like the natural litter bed rather than recreating it in the laboratory, thereby allowing it to maybe be a little more mixed in composition and burn in a more realistic way. Other colleagues, Bernard here is working in one of the only examples of prescribed burning being used as an experimental treatment in France. And Michel Venetier, many of you may know because he was here in Flagstaff this summer and is participating in a project in collaborating with us and with Neil Cobb of the Marion Powell Center on looking at tree responses to climatic variation from year to year. This was the center of Irstea in Toulonnais, which is a beautiful village right next to Aix-en-Provence. Here we're doing some sampling for climatic influences. This is related to what Michelle was working on. And some of you may know this guy, Arthur Reinelt, who graduated from here in 1990 with a master's degree and came for a visit. My slides are all showing pretty much natural areas of France, so I'm not showing pictures of the Eiffel Tower or anything. But this picture might be familiar to some of you. It's the Church of Notre Dame, Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. I was invited by colleagues from another French research organization to participate in a meeting about bringing together people from different disciplines and the public to talk about collaborating on ways to change forest management to adjust for climate change. It's exactly the same kind of thing that many of us in here have done with the Forest Restoration Initiative, with the Greater Flagstaff Forest Partnership, with all these kinds of the Diablo Trust, different kinds of collaborative groups coming together and discussing all these things. The one difference for me is that it was in Paris. Otherwise, it was extremely similar to the kinds of things that we have done here. It was really remarkable. There was a representative from an environmental organization, and her, not only her words, but her, I don't know, her, the way she spoke made her fit into a category. I'm sure I fit into a category too, you know? It's funny. I really like that picture. Okay, so turning to visiting some of these sites in the field. So one of the places I visited is Cyprus. And colleague Dimitris Saris, who I showed earlier, he is Greek, but he's a professor in Cyprus. Cyprus is a divided nation. It's an island here very far east, legally part of the European Union, but geographically really part of Asia. Divided between Greek-speaking Cypriots here. This is an independent nation, and then the northern part is occupied by Turkey and has been since 1974. So this says the last divided capital. If you think of Berlin or other places that were characteristic of the division of Europe after World War II, this is maybe the last. although the issues dividing it here are very different than the Soviet Union and West issues that divided Europe, the rest of Europe. So we got to see interesting places here. I enjoyed the spelling of the word highest here. I also liked how it said Sun Valley and Olympus and highest mountain. I mean, let's just throw it all in there. Why not? And we got to see some snow, which was fantastic in the Mediterranean. His name is Stavros, and he is a master's student working with Dimitris. He took his first tree course that day, which was a lot of fun in the woods. But these are Pinus nigra trees. You can see some of the characteristics of the flat-topped architecture, the massive horizontal branches that indicate trees that are extremely old. And also some trees with remarkable fire scars. As is the case in many places, it's true in some places in Mexico as well, certainly true in many European settings. When trees have cap faces like this, people come and hack wood, people meaning usually like shepherds, goat herds, people that were out there working, hack pieces of wood out of the scarred area because it's impregnated with resin. That's the tree's natural means of healing itself, and it makes great kindling for starting fires. These are fire scars embedded inside of a cut stump, and this is actually our priority for returning to this site and sampling because it will make getting permission a much easier thing. The reason this forest is still here is because there's a very strong protection program. And so getting permission to cut samples from trees like this is going to be complicated and may not happen. But another thing is that we looked at the interval between fires. In some of the other sites where we've looked at Pinus nigra, we have pretty frequent fires, maybe 10, 12, 15 years between fires. Here they were quite long. And that might be related to the geology here. These are serpentine soils, very nutrient-poor soils, very difficult growing environment on this mountain. This is Cedrus libani, that is preserved in a place called Cedar Valley, and the fact that it's preserved has a lot to do with the fact that that valley is a sacred area for one of the most important monasteries in Cyprus. So again, another kind of interesting connection between social values and forest characteristics. I went to Morocco with a group of people who were interested in, really in this kind of forest at all, but rather in dryland restoration. So Morocco sits south of Spain on the shoulder of North Africa. And looking at a satellite image, there are some areas that show up as being greener and higher in elevation. So some mountains that have forests. This was a really beautiful area, first time that I had seen any part of Africa. And the concern of, the concern of our colleagues was to work with restoration of dryland ecosystems like this that have been very heavily degraded by removal of natural vegetation and very heavy grazing over the years. So they're interested in dryland ecological restoration, but the specific things that they were trying to do, this was a project led by Mishish, who is right here with the white hat. This is Jordi Cortina, who was spent a year with us here in Flagstaff some years ago. Was to try to involve local people and institutions. So we were there for a week. We planted, I think, 4 trees. But we planted those 4 trees with a lot of different people. High school students, the women in these pictures here are representatives of women's groups and non-governmental organizations working with women. So the idea is to try to bring the community in and have an investment in that restoration, as opposed to hiring some forest technicians, planting the whole thing in a week, and then walking away and hoping that the community will do something to protect it. We went to this beautiful historic city of Chefchaouen, which is near this park. So in terms of looking at forests for the occurrence of Pinus nigra in Morocco, this park was the place to go. Really beautiful area, and here too we were able to find some old forests and some fire-scarred areas. I went to Spain briefly and looked in a place different than I looked before, the Sierra de Gredos, which maybe you know, Matt, right next to Madrid. And here, this colleague, Francisco Seijo, is working with chestnuts. He is an anthropologist working with understanding the relationship between people and natural resources. This is an old chestnut tree, gigantic, and these are young chestnuts forming a true dog hair thicket all around it. But the way that chestnuts were managed historically, because they're of great value, was in places like this, where the chestnuts were carefully tended on planted terraces, not surrounded by lots of competition, to allow the trees to grow well and to allow the crop to be collected. In this region, there is one village that's famous for their chestnuts that maintains this traditional management. So here we think about traditional ecological knowledge, and we think about Native American practices associated with fire and with natural resource management. We might think about long-term Hispanic practices or ranching practices that go back 100 years or so. Well, this is an example of traditional ecological knowledge in that European context. We found the type of Pinus nigra that one finds in this forest, which is just isolated trees. All the rest of these trees are Pinus pinaster, which is called maritime pine. The reason that pines are really important in the maritime industry is they have resin. And this is an example of a Pinus pinaster stump. You see all these deformations in here. Those are scars left behind by resin tapping. So the tree was grown intentionally to be used for resin. It was harvested to the maximum for resin, and then it was cut down to make way for a new crop. I also got to pretend I was a scientist with a white coat here in Barcelona. So Corsica is, as I mentioned, the part of France a separate island in the Mediterranean. Very rugged terrain, very interesting place. One, I guess you can fly there too, but arriving on a ferry is a really neat experience. This is the symbol of Corsica, and it's the national flag. And it's not clear where in history that image comes from. It's an interesting image. This is Pinus pinaster, an old Pinus pinaster tree. This is a gigantic fire, the aftermath of a severe fire in 2000. Corsica is characterized by long-term use of natural resources. The human populations are not high, but the villages are distributed in such a way that people have been intensively using most of the landscape for a long time. Corsica has a unique culture that is really evident in a lot of the things that people say, and it's also a very independent-minded place. The red on these maps, this is Corsica and this is southern France. The red means that they've had the most large fires and a lot of the biggest area burned. And much of that is made up by episodic events that are mega fires in 2000 and 2003. So with this group of folks, we went and visited some of these areas. In here, this open area with the cut stumps, this is a place where a severe fire burned in 2000 and the dead trees were cut down. Very heavy regeneration in the background, which is another future management issue. But when we looked at these stumps carefully, what we saw was something similar to the Greek situation. So in this case, this tree had 7 previous fire scars. It survived 7 previous surface fires and then was killed by the fire in 2000. So this will be an interesting opportunity to try to look at whether those same processes are going on. In Corsica, we did have the capability to collect fire-scarred samples. So I'm collecting one here. If any of you looked at the picture way back at the beginning of this presentation when Larissa was cutting a sample from a fire scar, she was using a chainsaw that's like a steel 440, a pretty good-sized chainsaw that has a lot of power. This is the kind of thing that you would use to trim little branches off a tree in your front yard or something like that. But we get out there, it's what they had. I'm wearing somebody else's, not their chaps, but these big pants that they like to wear in Europe that are like held up with suspenders, and they're huge on me. I've got this goofy helmet with the front thing that kept flipping down and trying to knock the helmet off my head. And I'm using this little saw that doesn't weigh anything, and you're holding it all weird, so you're trying to force it to cut through the wood. But, you know, I was trying to be professional, and it's what we had and all that, so... the colleagues at Earstia used to have a bigger saw, and they said it got stolen, so we couldn't take it. So I cut the sample, cut another sample that day. It's really hard with this little saw, but it was like, okay, I'm not going to say anything. We get back to the van, put the saw down, and I made a little comment then. I said, you know, this saw is a little bit tough tough to use. I was trying to excuse myself in case they were noticing how it was taking a long time to cut these samples and things like that. And so one of the colleagues says, well, yeah, I was kind of surprised you didn't use the big saw. I said, what big saw? So he moves the things in the back of the truck, and there's a really nice saw, which is actually this one right here, that we then used after that to collect a few more samples. So amazing forest there. This is a variety of Pinus nigra called Pinus nigra variety Laricio, and it scars much more readily than the regular, so to speak, Pinus nigra, or at least what's found in France and Spain. We did get to see a little experimental prescribed burn there, kind of a demonstration, and just really beautiful regions in Corsica. This is the pilot boat that brought the pilot out to the ferry. And that means we're shifting to the last couple minutes. So what I was able to do here was identify sites and partners. I have a lot of material for writing a lot of proposals. I have already worked with this European Forestry Scholar Program to be able to return to Europe next summer in a really neat program that I'm going to show you the website for in a minute, because other colleagues might be interested, where you can go and spend 2 weeks at one forestry institution or at 2 different ones. I'm going to 1 week in Finland and 1 week in Spain. It's not a lot of money. It pays for the plane ticket, but you get to see these other forestry schools and interact with their students and professors, and it's fun. And then I'm looking at, I'm currently preparing a proposal for European Union funding, and then looking at these other options as well for moving forward. So the last thing I wanted to mention in the minute that remains, at least by that clock, not by this one, sorry, is to comment on study abroad options. These are 3 options within our School of Forestry. Mike Wagner has a study abroad course in Ghana, and we'll be offering that next summer. Rich Hofstetter is offering a course that takes a trip. The course is here in Flagstaff, but takes a trip to Costa Rica in the fall semester of 2015. And in the spring semester of 2016, I'll be teaching with the USAC, University Studies Abroad Consortium in Chile, for 1 semester. And these are programs that might be of interest to NAU students. This is the program that I taught in, very different region of France in the southwestern corner. Here's our students. This is Sterling Wiltbank of the NAU School of Forestry, wearing a pink beret, so that, or a raspberry beret maybe, huh? And that was a fantastic experience in the Pyrenees as well. The Pyrenees divide France and Spain, and that's the French side, that's the Spanish side, and the cloud is telling the truth. It's much, much drier on the south face. The last, I already mentioned Peace Corps and Peace Corps Masters International, but another option for many researchers, postdocs, people finishing their PhDs, or faculty members is, of course, the various Fulbright programs for going overseas. So thank you very much. Fully used the time, so maybe no questions, but thank you very much. And I'm happy to talk afterwards.